Welcome to the Good Reading Magazine podcast. Good Reading is a monthly magazine dedicated to books and reading and aims to help readers discover their next favourite book. You can find out more about the books discussed on today's podcast at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.
Henry Reynolds' trailblazing work has changed the way we see the intertwining of black and white history in Australia. His books include The Other Side of the Frontier, which won the Victorian Premier's Award for Non-Fiction, Unnecessary Wars, This Whispering in Our Hearts Revisited, Truth-Telling, History, Sovereignty and the Uluru Statement, and as co-author of What's Wrong with Anzac and Tonga First Nations leader and Tasmanian war hero. Today I'm talking to Henry Reynolds about his new book, Looking from the North, Australian History from the Top Down. Henry, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Oh, it's nice to be with you.
In the opening pages of Looking from the North, you write about a regional patriotism and a corresponding provincialism, which you became aware of by seeing Australia from the north down. How did that perspective come about?
To go to North Queensland, as we did 50 years ago, it was a long way away. It took much longer to get there than it does now. 2.5 hours flying just from Brisbane. And we came from Tasmania. That's where we'd grown up. And you're moving on a continental sphere from latitude 42 to latitude 19, from cool West Coast, moderate climate to full tropical climate, well within the tropics, with a monsoonal climate like East Asia, Southeast Asia. So there are all sorts of things about it. It looked differently, the skies were different, the wind was different, there were different smells in the air. It was physically, it was a big move. But and that's the first thing that is obvious. But the point was that there were many, many other things about that society which were very new to us. And it took us a long time to sort of come to terms with it. Unlike so many people that we knew who came for a year or two and then left and went back south, as a great many people still do who come to the north, we stayed for a variety of reasons for over 30 years. So we really did become attuned to the physical environment and very much took up the sense of being on the outskirts. Being really provincial and having to struggle with the capital 1,000 kilometres away for any development that we wanted in the north. And Margaret, my partner, first she got into the city council, and then for 16 years she was the senator for North Queensland. So we became very, very much involved in a sense of feeling we belonged to it and we had to fight for it. So we did become patriots for the north.
You write about two eras of colonisation in this part of Australia, carried out by two distinct centres of responsibility, the first by the British and the second by Australia. What was the difference in that sense of responsibility?
That is something which only occurred to me much later. It should have been obvious, but it wasn't. And no one else seems to have got the point. The Australian colonies, apart from Western Australia, became self-governing in the 1850s, and they ran their own affairs and they had their own parliaments. And Queensland joined them in 1859. So by 1859, all the eastern colonies, including South Australia, were self-governing. Now, if you take Australia in 1860-61, and it's a good year to do so because it happened to be a year when there was a census all over Australia, as there was all over the British Empire. In many ways, the colonisation of the South was highly successful. By then, the population had reached over 1 million. The pastoral industry had established itself thoroughly. Australia was becoming the great producer of fine wool for British woolen mills. The gold rushes had made us an incredibly wealthy society. And within a year or two, the Australian-born population was about to pass the immigrants, or the convicts or whatever, from the British Isles. Melbourne and Sydney were already cities of quite some consequence, even globally. So you could say that by then, the colonisation had been a success. A great number of, the Aboriginal population had declined dramatically by then, and many of the Aboriginal people were already of mixed descent. So that's the colonisation of the South, led by Britain, the great power of the era. But the extraordinary thing is, in 1861, in the whole of North Australia, above the Tropic of Capricorn, that is 45% of the landmass, there wasn't anyone. There was not a single colonist at all. And that's the fact that is overwhelmingly important. Now, the people who became responsible for North Queensland, the Northern Territory, and then later in Western Australia with the Kimberley after 1890, the colonisation was carried out by the colonial governments with no real involvement of the British. So one era of colonisation was overseen and directed by the world's greatest power. The second era of colonisation was overseen by very, very small colonial Australian societies. And in Queensland's case, only less than 100,000 people concentrated in the south. So in a sense, it's an extraordinary story. And the British, in a way, had handed over the whole of tropical Australia to the colonists. And therefore, the whole of the Indigenous population. And it was by far the most heavily populated, particularly around the coastal regions, where they had not been killed in frontier conflict, where there hadn't been any of the great epidemics like the smallpox epidemic of the early settlement of New South Wales. So it is an extraordinary story. Now, Queensland began the colonisation of this vast area only in 1861 with the establishment of a small colony in the north at what is now the small town of Bowen. That was the first advance into the tropics, and in a way it began from there. So when you look at it in this way, they are two very different stories, and yet we never really thought of it in that way. In a way, everything begins anew. It's a long way north. The settlement had reached into central Queensland, in and around Rockhampton, but it's still a long way north. It took them weeks of wet season travel, that is the party that came overland, and then two parties came by ship into Port Denison, bringing settlers, but also equipment and domestic animals. And they established this small town, largely at that stage under canvas. But already the new Queensland government had surveyed that area and opened it up for colonisation. Above all, colonisation by pastoralists, which is the way most of Australia had been settled up to that point. And so along with the the small party of officials and their families, were many, many land seekers, because the government was offering to would-be pastoralists very large blocks of land if they went out and claimed it and then came in and established that and got the boundaries correct. They had a year initially to stock it. And if they stocked it, they then had a lease for 14 years, which could then be extended. So it was a way to get land settlement happening quickly. And indeed it was, because here was basically land, large areas of land for nothing. And people had to then go and buy their animals. They had to go and buy their mainly sheep, but also cattle, and drive them north, set them down on the land they'd claimed, and endeavour to begin as pastoralists. This is what had happened a generation or more earlier, from the 1830s, in the whole Murray-Darling area, right up to the Darling Downs. So it was repeating that story of early pastoralism. But for the Indigenous people, it was a transformation, an absolute revolution. These people moving in, but above all moving in with large numbers of exotic animals. And in a way, it was the animals who were more disruptive than the Europeans, because these large blocks of land, they only had a relatively small, they couldn't afford to employ large numbers of European workers, so they moved onto their blocks of land, sometimes, square miles of it, large blocks of land, along the river frontages of the Burdekin system. The big river was the Burdekin, and many, many tributaries. So within a couple of years, the would-be pastoralists had occupied almost every river frontage in that vast area, and had brought in their sheep and their cattle. And so that was the rapid beginning of the settlement of the north. And in a way, that was repeated over and over again as they moved right across the north of the continent, because the north of the continent, between the tropical lowlands and the central deserts, was a vast savanna that goes from the Queensland coast right across to the edges of the Indian Ocean in the Kimberley and the Pilbara. And this was the land that became the real attraction for European settlement. And as I say, if you went out, you saw a desirable block with supply of water, you hurried back to the town, in that case Bowen, to the land commissioner, who was there in a large marquee, and you registered your claim, and you became in effect a landowner.
And what were the immediate consequences of the squatting movement for First Nations people?
As I say, they suddenly found their homelands. And remember, what we have, is a mosaic of small, self-governing, independent nations all over Australia. And suddenly, over the horizon, come these parties of utter alien people. They may well have heard of white people in the south. They'd already acquired small bits of equipment, and nails and glass and sometimes even axes and things had been passed along the frontier. They'd also certainly heard about the mystery and the power of guns. But suddenly they too were confronted where the white men had arrived. And as I say, it wasn't just the white men. There may only have been 5 or 6 or 7 of them, and they settled down in one place, on the river bank probably. But they had these vast flocks of foreign animals who simply took over the grassland, surrounded the water holes, and the land began to change. But above all, the squatters in Queensland were determined to keep the Indigenous people out from their own country, if necessary, to shoot at them. So they kept away. And so you had this early period of real conflict, and equally, fairly soon, the First Nations people came to realise that the last thing to do was to try and confront the Europeans because of their guns. It was far better to occasionally pick off a shepherd, and they were still using shepherds for sheep farming. There were no fences. So you could occasionally pick off a shepherd or two, but above all, you began to attack the animals. And that was pretty easy because they were large areas without fences. So it was comparatively easy to attack the sheep and cattle. They obviously appreciated that these had real value for the white men. And if you wanted to drive the white men away, possibly the most easy way to do it and the safest way was to attack their sheep and cattle, which happened on a very large scale. And see, many of these squatters they still hadn't established themselves. They were probably still living on credit. They had no income yet. And so attacks on their animals were very serious. That situation lasted in this specifically area around Bowen, around the Burdekin Basin. It lasted for about 5 years of open conflict until the obvious solution was to actually get the Indigenous people to come in, because they would be living in rugged hill country, because there were enough hills, or around the coast they would hide down in the mangroves or actually move on to offshore islands. But it soon became obvious that letting them in was made far more sense than keeping them out. And so that happened by 1869. Letting them in became the established practice. Letting them both into Bowen itself to live on the fringes of the town, and letting them into the stations where they became the workforce. And this is the other critical thing, because North Australia had an abundance of territory, but very few people. You see, the difference is that in the north, there was no convict system. In the southeast, where the same process took place, the British, and if you include Van Diemen's Land in this, Tasmania, 150,000 young men and women were brought into the workforce as convicts. As cheap labour. They came without dependents. They could go straight into the workforce. And above all, they could be sent anywhere, so that you could send them into the most dangerous places, and they had to go. It was either that or the road, or a chain gang. So convict labour was so important in the south. It didn't exist in the north. As a result, there was always a dramatic shortage of white labour. And what labour there was very expensive. So the Aborigines very quickly became the major workforce for the pastoral industry right across the north. And that was a situation that lasted right up until the 1960s.
Federalisation in 1901 is heralded as the birth of a nation, a bringing together of disparate colonies and territories into a cohesive unit of governance, and the belief that, as you write, the ultimate expression of a deep sense of belonging to a clearly defined homeland. But you suggest that that wasn't a universally accepted position, and doubt whether any of these propositions applied to colonists of the north. Why so?
One, because, as I say, there was such a limited number of Europeans, even by federation. There was only about 5,000 Europeans in the whole of the Northern Territory. I mean, it's astonishing. There weren't that many more in the comparable part of Western Australia, the Kimberley. Queensland was the one place, and partly as a result of the sugar industry, but also because of geography. It was easy to access the coastal ports. It was easy to come and go from the south all the way up the coast. The European population became quite significant in those coastal towns, Mackay, Rockhampton, Townsville, Cairns. And where mining was successful, like in Charters Towers, there were reasonably large European populations. But going west, say of Charters Towers and some of the minefields, there was very, very few Europeans in the whole territory. And the other consequences of this was that there were large numbers of non-Europeans. There really wasn't a white Australia north of Capricorn. And although that was a real worry, it was inevitable given the, not that many people from the south, from the established communities in the south, wanted to go and live in the remote north. And that continues to be the case up to the present. As we know, the north, particularly coal in Queensland, iron in Western Australia, the great resource basins of Australia, but the workforce is largely fly in, fly out. We still don't, in a sense, have that sense of settling the north.
I was a little troubled by the words of our first Prime Minister, Edmund Barton, on the doctrine of equality. He wrote, "Nothing we can do by cultivation, by refinement, or by anything else will make some races equal to others." How did that point of view influence policy around the empty north and the whole idea of a white Australia in that region?
There'd be many filing cabinets full of documents about what to do about the empty north. Those people in the first parliament, but above all, they wanted to make sure that Australia remained white. They did not believe in racial equality, and few Europeans did at the time. And above all, they realised that if you didn't believe in racial equality, you certainly did not want to have intermarriage and the production of what they would see as a hybrid race, because the white race would deteriorate if you got a great deal of interracial marriage. So their problem was, what do they do with this huge area of the north? And there were people who said, look, if by developing it we need non-European labour, it'd be best not to develop it. Now, they were able, you see, the sugar industry had been developed with Pacific Island labour, the equivalent in a way of the convict labour in the south. Many tens of thousands of Pacific Island labourers were responsible for the success of the sugar industry. Now, they weren't the only people working in the sugar industry, but without that cheap labour, Australian sugar would have been far too expensive to compete with sugar from Fiji on one side and Mauritius on the other, where you had cheap labour. Having established that, they determined, and Barton determined, that the Pacific Islanders had to be deported, all of them. That was the intention. No matter how long they'd been there, no matter how much they'd contributed, they had to go. And the point about the Pacific Islanders, they didn't have a nation state to protect them. So they could simply be sent back. Now, as it turned out, not all of them went for a variety of reasons, but you couldn't do the same with the Japanese, who had already moved into Thursday Island, or the Chinese, who were particularly important in North Queensland and in Darwin. Darwin was overwhelmingly a Chinese town. They had the protection of a nation state, and in some cases, with people from Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, Chinese from those areas were British subjects. So they couldn't just send them out. So they determined to make sure their communities wouldn't grow by not allowing them to bring anyone in. Relations, extended family, partners, wives, these people couldn't be brought in. So the population in the north, the non-European population, slowly began to decline. And by the census of 1947, which was the first census for many years, the non-European population of the north had declined very dramatically. So in a way, after the Second World War, they sort of had achieved their aim of creating a white Australia in the north. But that didn't get around the problem of how you have an economy where you don't have many people. And even now, you see, 45% of the landmass only has 5% of the Australian population in it.
Since the federal government's white paper, Our North, Our Future, of more or less a decade ago, and the subsequent action plan for 2024 to 2029, that stimulated considerable interest in Northern Australia and the prospect of great hopes for its future. Yet you write, Post-colonial eyes are still confounded by old and enduring problems. The demographic facts are as troubling as ever. What do you think are the implications of these policies for Northern Australia and Australia as a whole?
Well, there's still the problem of getting people to live there. The Queensland coast, Townsville and Cairns are the only two cities of real size. They are now nearly 250,000 each. They now have universities, and they are quite reasonable cities and have the capacity to be centres of growth. But beyond there, the Northern Territory has a dramatic overturn of population. I mean, unlike anywhere else in Australia, something like a quarter of the population move every year, and that's astonishing. And so the population, people move in, but people move out. So the overall population doesn't increase all that quickly. And as I say, so much of the workforce now is fly in, fly out. Up to 100,000 people fly into the mining districts and out again, back home. And they just live in dongas, This is the way in which the workforce comes and goes. So there is that problem of encouraging people to move to the north and to stay. And we knew that because we went through generations of friends in Townsville. So many people came, but I think it's lovely, but after 2 or 3 years, they go south. Well, partly for promotion and family. I mean, almost everyone you knew in North Queensland didn't have family. That family was all in the south. And so there's still that demographic problem about the north, and government wants to deal with it. But increasingly, what the north is promising is a base for fighting. This is the destiny of certainly of the north, that if the Defence Department was given the green light, simply have more bases, more soldiers simply go where they're told. That famous, very, very sophisticated Mahbubani, Kishore Mahbubani, a Indian Singaporean international figure, but also is very interested in Australia. He said a few years ago, Australia can choose between the place where East and West meet, or it can be the spear of pushing Western interest into Asia. And we still haven't decided which we want it to be. And so much of the talk about the North, indeed, is about developing. And James Cook University, where I spent so long, indeed, wants to be a centre for clearly tropical studies and tropical medicine and bringing people in and moving out. I've got a large campus in Singapore. All of these things are true, and many people in Darwin have this strong sense that they are much closer to Asia than they are to Southern Australia. So there is that bridge to the region, and we now no longer have a white Australia. We're no longer a British Australia. But at the same time, there's still that fear of Asia that's been there since the 19th century. And there is that sense that we are likely to have to fight China, which is an astonishing thing to look forward to. But there's no question that thought runs through Australian defence policy.
My final question to you, Henry, is about something you discuss in the conclusion of your book, where you cite the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2007, ratified by the Rudd government in 2009. You suggest that this declaration has particular relevance to Northern Australia and for Indigenous people, and also in the context of what we've just been talking about as building bridges to Australia and readying the spear.
Well, there's two things. One, the history and the geography of the North meant that when the whole land rights situation changed, And firstly, under the Whitlam and then Fraser governments, when they passed the Northern Territory Land Rights Act, and a large amount of the Northern Territory passed back to the Indigenous people, and they set up the big land councils. This was followed by Mabo and Wick, the two great High Court cases. Now that means that so much of the North now has returned to the ownership in one form or another, because there are different forms of tenure, that large amounts of the North have returned into the Indigenous people because they never left. That's the whole point. And right across the pastoral North, the Aborigines stayed on their country. And so when land ownership changed, it means now that a great deal of the North has returned into the hands of the Indigenous local people. And at the same time, as the complementary movement was that people began to move back to their country from the big missions and settlements, the homelands movement. So in the Kimberley now, 97% of the land is held by Aboriginal people, something like 50% in the Northern Territory and 60 or so percent in Cape York, and something like 80% of the coastline. So it is, this is revolutionary. And it's because so much of it is in remote country, most Australians are scarcely aware of it, but it is an extraordinary development. Now, the point about the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, it became bipartisan because Julie Bishop was one of its great promoters internationally. So it's been a bipartisan policy for the last 10 years. We have committed ourselves internationally. Now, what most people don't know, and perhaps many people didn't read this, was that it has a section on whether or not the land of Indigenous people can simply be used for defence reasons. And if so, you've got to have negotiations. And ideally, people should be consulted and given the right to not have their land used for military purposes. So this is, a case of an absolute collision between these two things: the Indigenous control of land, and particularly the coastline, and the white Australia's desire to build up the North as a base for war against China. How do you bring those two things together? And it takes us back to the way in which the land of the Central Australian people were used by the British to blow up their atomic weapons in the 50s and 60s. It does. I think there is a future situation where these two forces are going to meet, and it brings us to that thing. Does the North mean we're going to have close relations with the North, or are we going to get involved in a catastrophic war, which people in Southeast Asia have no desire to be involved in? But Australia, in a way, is caught in this incredibly difficult dilemma.
Henry Reynolds, looking from the North, thank you for bringing the history to us, and thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you very much for your discussion. I enjoyed it, and I hope that people will follow all the issues we took up.
I've been talking to Henry Reynolds about his new book, Looking from the North, Australian History from the Top Down. It's published by New South, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to Good Reading print and online magazine at goodreadingmagazine.com.au.